and let's get our little, oh God. I'm gonna turn off the meeting questions here. Okay, so I think we have notes going and we have a recording going. This is great. Welcome everybody to our FOAK event. We have a really rock star group of panelists today. I will be your moderator. I'm Dmitry Gershenson. A few housekeeping items before we get started. So first and foremost, this is meant to be an interactive session. There's a chat. Everyone has access to the chat. You are welcome to write your questions in the chat and we'll get to them as we possibly can. If you have just joined, please turn off your video unless you are a panelist. So that's our one request. We will try to answer your questions in real time. We have lots of content here, so please, we'll do our best to respond to you as quickly as possible. One other thing that I will say, so Enduring Planet, my company, is a partner of the upcoming Green Biz Verge event, which is happening in October in the Bay Area. Is one of the, let's say, like premier climate events every year. And if you want to attend, you can use my code to get a 10% discount. There's also a Startups to Watch competition, and you can apply to be a startup to watch. It gets you in front of potential investors and buyers. So take a look if you want to get some sweet opportunity to connect with corporates and investors in the space. And then today we're going to be taking a slightly different perspective on FOAK. I think oftentimes the events that we've seen in the space really focus on kind of what's the state of the market and how hard it is. And sure, I think that's important. But we wanted to get real tactical. And so we have 4 people here who play very different roles in the market. We have an entrepreneur who has built a company that has raised every kind of financing you can think of, the original FOAK in many ways, and is now public and can share that whole trajectory. We have Patrick from, and that's Jennifer, by the way, from LanzaTech. We have Patrick from Schmidt, who does a lot of really creative catalytic finance work in the market. We have Christian from Generate, who picks up projects that have gone through FOAK and takes them much further. And then we have Hannah, who leads partnerships at Mark One, and Mark One helps companies structure and design and build these types of projects, right? So we have the full suite of perspectives from entrepreneur to investor to advisor to catalytic capital. And so we're going to kind of push this group to really get into the meat of this really challenging problem that I think most hard tech, climate tech companies face. And so with that, why don't we do quick introductions? Let's go Hannah, Patrick, Christian, Jennifer. Just 1 minute. You can say who you are, your business, and what you do in the space, and then we'll get into it.
Wonderful. Thanks, Dmitry. And this room knows that we will keep it light, we will keep it spicy, we will keep it candid with you. So thank you all for joining. I can't believe this is almost our 7th or 8th community event together. I'm Hannah, for those of you who know me. For those of you who don't know me, I'm still Hannah. It's great to be here with these amazing panelists today. I do a couple things and wear a few hats in the climate ecosystem, but have been perseverating about how to scale through this kind of messy middle for a number of years now. I wear a venture partner hat at Planeteer Capital, which is a pre-seed and seed VC fund that we helped get off the ground a little over 2 years ago. So if you're building in the pre-seed and seed space in hardware-enabled software, you can reach out about that. I spend a lot of my time as a fractional CFO with a number of different companies sitting on that side of the bench, where I have intimately felt the problems when you go from $900 a ton in an offtake negotiation to $600 a ton, and it breaks the total economics. I've got nothing on Jennifer in that space and everything that she's been through, but have seen a lot. And last but not least, as Dmitry said, I help lead partnerships and have helped select some of the first few projects that we serve at Mark One, which is a developer as a service. It's a really intense intended to be the strategic planning and co-developer that goes at risk with you in the first of a kind projects to really do the work.
And most importantly, Hannah is also the co-host of this Enduring Planet and Friends series with us. So thank you for all that incredible support and partnership. Okay, Patrick.
All right. Hi, everyone, I'm Pat McGrath. I lead up the climate tech portfolio at the Schmidt Family Foundation. And our focus is really to help address the scaling gap, to help get emerging technologies in hard to abate sectors to a scale that matters so that we can get on track for getting all the way to zero on a time scale that matters. My own background, I'm a chemical engineer by training, and I've spent most of my career in early stage R&D. So most recently spent 7 years on a 3-year term at RPE. Worked but really across the board with a lot of really innovative companies, including LanzaTech, but worked on everything from nuclear fusion to plant biology. So in my time there, and motivates the program that we're running at Schmidt, just saw again and again that we had a lot of really fantastic and innovative companies that were coming to the stage where they prove it's not impossible. We know what this looks like. We might even have customers interested, but then just a brick wall. And one of the last things I did at RPE was help launch the Scale Up program, which was to give a little bit more runway to help get these technologies to investable outcomes. Sitting on the other side now in philanthropy, looking for ways that we can find philanthropic capital to help navigate all of the traps that between here and true scale. And plenty more to discuss, and looking forward to the conversation.
Hi, everyone. Christian Okoye at Generate Capital. For any of you guys who don't know Generate, we're one of the earliest and leading kind of sustainable infrastructure investors, about 10 billion of assets under management. I help us look at emerging technologies. So everything from, anything kind of in industrial decarbonization. We did a project we announced this year, we've been working on for a couple of years, in green steel, which is going to use renewables for an electric arc furnace. We've also had a foray into green hydrogen, which I've helped with, which has had some ups and downs, but we're still very excited about that. And we continue to kind of look across this space and trying to see what we can do, and everything from you kind of new energy loads for addressing data centers to how do you make more green materials broadly. My background is in project finance, venture capital, growth equity. Spend a lot of time kind of helping companies around Series A, Series B, Series C, try to get through the inflection point to project finance. And now I'm kind of on the other side of that, trying to help us assess when those companies are ready, but also trying to coach companies to what we need to see, and how they can prepare to get ready for project finance.
Awesome. Jennifer.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Holmgren, the CEO of LanzaTech. I have spent 30 years in the process industry, scaling new technologies. First, working for the refining and petrochemical sector, where we made the first drops of drop-in aviation fuel, SAF, as it's now called, to where I am today at LanzaTech, where we use all manner of waste carbon feedstocks, recycle that to make sustainable aviation fuel, materials, etc. The point being, there's enough waste carbon above ground to make all the things we need in our daily lives, and we need to just transition away from that linear, constantly pulling fresh carbon out of the ground and dumping it somewhere. Don't know where. Can be the sky, can be the ocean, can be a litter pile. And that is what LanzaTech does. Just quickly, we have built multiple first-of-a-kind plants, i.e. different gas streams. We've worked in China, in Europe, in India, to take waste carbon to ethanol, from a steel mill gas to a ferroalloy gas. We've done demonstrations with municipal solid waste. After having built that first-of-a-kind, and we all call it crossing the valley of death, I am pleased to report that I am in the Grand Canyon of death right now, trying to create a scalable, profitable company. And my husband, who is always right, told me once that was the Grand Canyon. And I now realize the wisdom in what he says. So really looking forward to speaking with all of you and sharing my trials and tribulations and some successes.
I think that's a perfect segue to kick off this conversation. So Jennifer, let's actually start with you. Let's rewind. We can talk about the Grand Canyon later, but I think, curious to hear about your experience building this sort of first, from what I understand, the first real commercial facility at Lanza in China in 2018, which is what, about 4 years after your big Series D. So like, when did this project really get started, right? When, how did you give us sort of the narrative arc? I know I'm going to ask a lot here, but in 5 minutes, give us the story of this project from its inception to its sort of like, everything from site selection, roadmap, et cetera. Talk about that.
Well, so first of all, we built our first demonstration plant with the same partner. So that's actually quite an important element because we were able to go from what was 100,000 gallon a year plant to a 30 million gallon a year plant with the same partner because they got their hands wet and understood the technology. Because you have to remember that nobody had ever commercialized or even scaled to a demo scale gas fermentation, right? So this was all new, scary ground. And so I felt that there was this massive advantage to have a partner that took the view that if the demo ticked the box, then they would go for the commercial plant. And I think that was massively helpful in our journey. I would also say, and this is something.
Before you move on, when you say partner, you mean like an EPC, or can you
No,
define that partner a little more
thank you.
explicitly?
Thank you for that. I appreciate that, Dimitri, because I assumed yeah, our partner is a steel mill. So what we were
Got it.
commercializing was technology to take a steel mill gas, carbon monoxide rich gas, to ethanol. And so we were using a steel mill gas, a blast furnace or a basic oxygen furnace gas. And so that partner, we went to their plant in near Beijing, about 3 hour drive from Beijing. We built a demo there, our very first demo. Well, actually, we built two demos in parallel. I'll get to that in a second. But we built a demo there, and then when that ticked all their boxes, then we went and built the commercial with them. And these
Got
were,
it.
yeah, and this was a licensing deal. And we can talk, I'm sure, about licensing later. But they were very highly motivated, so they had a strategic reason to want to do this project. And that's what drove them, right? We want to reduce our carbon intensity. We want to reduce our emissions. We want to use this as a license to grow. They wanted to expand their steel mill. Um, and so they needed to show carbon abatement. So that is how we got to that first of a kind commercial plant. And it was by working with a partner who had also built a smaller plant that made them comfortable with our technology. We, when you think about the arc and the interest and the customer interest, one of the things that was really important, and that's why our first plant was in China. When we looked globally where we could go, 50% of the world's steel was made in China. So we focused on talking to people in China, but also, to be honest, we asked everybody if they were interested, and we got laughed out of the room 99% of the time. But one of the things that resonated in China was in the rest of the world, the steel, well, in the US and Europe in particular, steel was in kind of a receding mode. They were in super optimized mode rather than grow mode. When you're in optimized mode, you don't tend to want to try new things. What you want to do is, get more efficient and reduce headcount. And so that was the other nice thing about China. They wanted to grow that industry. And so anything that looked novel, technology-wise, that could help them grow the industry resonated in a way that it didn't resonate in other parts of the world.
I wanna just quickly turn. There were two questions that I think are worth covering just quickly. One is, did the partner co-invest in the project or invest in the company at all, or were they just a sort of a customer? And then the second was that, was there actually a contractual obligation on the part of the partner And maybe if you can just share, if the demo was successful, were they already committing to the next phase, or did you have to resell it to them again?
Yeah, so I'll start with that one. There was no contractual obligation to build a commercial if the demo worked. And I would catalog that as that would have been a brilliant thing to contract, but beggars can't be choosers. And when we raised our C round, my number one priority was to get that demo built, right? So I wasn't going to make it so anybody had to commit to anything else because it would have just taken forever to get past, right? And so we focused on let's get that demo built. How do we justify getting the demo built? And let's get that moving. That's what got me from C to D, right? Was the demo clicking that box got us the D funding to continue to grow the company through that commercialization phase. They put all the money in. We put no money in. These deals were 100% licenses. So we licensed the technology. They put the steel in the ground. Now, of course, we committed to making it work. So it wasn't like we weren't supplying a lot of, the manpower, the engineering packages at discounted rates and things like that. We understood it to be first of a kind. And so even though they put in the capital, it was truly a partnership where we contributed a lot of in-kind resources. But these first of a kinds are hundreds of millions of dollars, right? Well, this was 50 million, it was China. But it was enough that we didn't have the balance sheet. And I think you have to go back to what I said about our technology being first of a kind. Unfortunately, because it was first of a kind technology, not just first of a kind plant, we had to devote a lot of money to R&D and optimization and engineering. And so, with a limited balance sheet, you either spend it on developing the technology to the point that it's going to scale successfully, or you also build the plant, right? We didn't have the luxury of having a ready technology that all we needed to do was get enough cash to build that first commercial. So it was choices. It's always choices. What do you put your money in? What's the best way to move forward?
Okay, let's save some of the other questions for later. I think we can we can just keep asking Jennifer questions for an hour and a half, but I don't think that's the goal just yet. So Christian, I want to turn to you. I think one of the big things that matters for whether it's private equity or project finance investors is trust, right? And I don't mean like implicit trust. Oh, I like you, I'm going to trust you. It's also obviously bigger questions around data, performance. They need to trust that the project will actually deliver the results that they expect so they can hit their target IRR. So when you guys look at teams, whether it's Lonza, equivalents, et cetera, what helps you build that trust? What are the kind of key building blocks of demonstrating trust, whether it's early, mid, late?
Yeah, it's super interesting hearing Jennifer's story, and I'd love to hear more about it too. I've got a lot of questions, but I think it's exactly what they were trying to build. It's like it's that track record, right? So it's effectively, what did your demo plant look like? What is your scale up from that demo plant to your commercial plant? How much does that second plant look like the first plant? Like really being able to prove that you've standardized this process and you've got good data to back it up. If you don't have good data, do you have good relevant projects that you can point to and say like, look, this looks very, very similar to ours because of X, Y, and Z. And you can kind of point to those things and why you think you're going to be successful, right? And so it's like some of that is building that convincing story. Hopefully, what the more data and more robust it is, the better, right? And so, those are the key things that we look for. And the more that you've done this in the past, and you have people on your team who've done this in the past who are working together, or have some track record working to get together, ideally, and like it's not easy, but if we're ever going to lean into development, which we only do opportunistically, we really want to see developers who have a track record in something similar. So, we backed a green hydrogen developer, and they had a track record of doing a whole lot of solar to, kind of together, and also doing kind of methanol, kind of gray methanol, and, you know, being able to kind of combine those skill sets for green hydrogen, right? So oil and gas experience as well as solar experience. And again, that track record was important for us. And so once you do that and you're kind of building your process out, you're talking to all of the customers, and then we feel more comfortable. We have more conviction that you know how to build the right type of contracts. You're thinking about all of the things that you know we're going to be focused on. And at the same time, we're kind of telling you, look, this is our list of things that we need to see in order to move our project forward. I think it's really having that alignment, and the more that you have that track record and you have more of that data, and you've done some of that already, and you come to us and have that conversation. We're like, okay, we can get conviction around it, because I'm getting all of these questions from our investment committee, and how do we know that this is something that we, because we're not VC. It can't be, 1 or 2 out of 10 go successful for us. It has to literally be the opposite. Probably 9 out of 10, if not more, have to be successful. And so, like, how do we have comfort that we're going to get that?
I mean, I guess my follow-up to that is, this concept that Jennifer presented around using the same customer from demo to pilot to commercialization, like, is that something that helps build trust because it's the same parties involved and it shows this increasing commitment? Or does it actually communicate the opposite because it's not being sold to someone else and showing this like evolution, right? So I guess, like, how do investors view that? And then, another follow-up is this concept of like, oh, we didn't actually build it, we licensed them the technology, they built it. Does that help or does it hurt?
I don't think we care who built it as long as it gets built, right? And so the folks who are building it actually know what they're doing, all right? And so, whether that's an EPC or that's the customer, or if that's you, but you have to have a track record. So the person who has the most track record, if we can kind of trust that he can build it, that's most important for us. And in terms of like having one customer versus multiple customers, obviously we want to see a pipeline of projects. But there are times when we're doing a large project. It's like the Green Steel project I mentioned was a $200 million project, right? That's, at the back end, they have multiple customers, but it is kind of like one project that they're doing. So like we care less about the pipeline of customers after that, right? It's more so like get this one project. And if we can kind of get that with them, that's great. Sometimes we'll look at multiple projects where it's like we might do $10-25 million per project, and we want to see a robust pipeline, right? So, and if it's concentrated with one customer and they go away, that can be challenging. I think, growth equity, private equity investors probably look at it a little bit differently, where they want to see multiple customers. Customer concentration is not a great thing. But for infrastructure, if it's a credit-worthy customer who can do multiple projects, that's something that we can work with. And if that customer is leaning in, like it sounds like was the case with Lots of Tech, that's even better for us, right? It's because we like to see corporate partnerships. I do think that the projects that have had success and got off the ground have had good corporate projects. If you look at Fervo and some of the others, they have good corporate partnerships. And so some of it is, how do you find the right type of partner that has the right experience that you can learn from? And over time, like, maybe you're just licensing your technology versus having to build it yourself. And that's actually a great place to be in if you build your business model around that.
Okay, so I want to double click on that because Christian, you gave a lot of value packed information there, and particularly like I want to highlight to this room that like not every investor audience is the same. And not every partner audience will think about your FOAK risk the same. What do I mean by those two things? Your investors, if you're talking to a growth equity investor, as Christian mentioned, you might have the like, I want to see this project get done really well, even if that means some creative fancy footwork around licensing meets, novel tech risk, but you're doing the engineering design package as part of partnership, as Jennifer mentioned. Project financiers, like actual bankers, they will not care about any of that. They're going to want to see everything already done once before, and they will care way more about the pipeline of what they can actually deploy next, right? The Brookfields, the HSBCs, the like much larger asset managers out there. And so you're telling very different stories to those very different audiences, and the time between them is often very short. We'll highlight. But Jennifer, what you said earlier about the different, in your introduction, you said, we've had multiple FOAK scale-ups over time, which is actually an interesting oxymoron, because how many times are you doing something the first? And what you said about the tech risk, the application differences, the engineering risk when you are doing that EPC work versus licensing out some of the technology and doing design package work with them, all of those are going to be perceived differently by EPC partners, by customers at that kind of partner level FOAK risk. So Jennifer, I'm wondering if you could double click a little bit on what Christian was just describing and say, like, tell us more, how did you actually decide which FOAK risks to take on first in your journey, and then in what order came the rest of them?
You know, please understand that everything looks really well planned in retrospect, right? But there is an element of, you know, trying to open doors sometimes, that there is you have to overlay flexibility to a plan, okay? And one of the most important things we needed to prove is that gas fermentation could make yields at scale that were economic. You know, at the end of the day, it wasn't a bacterial problem, but an engineering problem. It is about mass transfer. And so for us, the biggest and most important thing for us to prove is a large reactor at scale could achieve what we could achieve at pilot and at demo in terms of performance. So didn't really care what the gas was, didn't really care about where it was, just wanted to build one big enough that we could see that our models on scale up worked. And that was our first priority. And that's what we pitched everybody. And so then the second element of proof becomes different gases, right? What other gas combinations could you use and make that work? And so that was the next layer. And then that included then expanding to non-steel mills, you know, ferroalloy refinery, et cetera. And that would show the extensibility of the technology. Those were the layers. And then the third one was geographic, because we really felt that, honestly, if you tell yourself, why do I do this? Does LanzaTech do it? Because we want to massively abate carbon emissions. And so that meant, you know, we needed a chicken in every pot, right? We needed to be everywhere. So for us, showing our technology globally so we could diffuse it without people saying, well, that works in China, but it doesn't work in Europe, was the next level that we needed to unlock. So that was the 3 layers that we needed to unlock. And that's, if you look at what we've done, we did it in that sequence: steel mill and ferroalloy, steel mill, refinery, municipal solid waste. China, Europe, India, Japan.
I think this sequencing is something that we hear about a lot, right? And I think both you and Christian have talked about this now. And it's actually, this is like a great transition. So Hannah, let's bring you to the forefront for a second. So, you know, you guys have launched this business, right? Mark One, it's a joint venture between RMI and Deep Science Ventures to help folks demonstrate and build investability, right? And we've now heard, like, what is it that people are looking for? What shows that a project is kind of like developer ready? So let's dive into that a little deeper. How do you guys help folks become sort of investment ready? What makes a developer really ready?
You bet. One of the things we observed by talking to over 1,000 different companies preparing to or in the process of building their FOAK projects, we learned that it's not just a financing gap. That is very real, the FOAK financing gap. Pat has a big role to play in that. Christian has done an amazing amount of work in that space. It's very real. Few people are as charismatic as Jennifer and can have the type of capital pathway that she's had. But we need more of that financing. That's not what Mark One is solving. Instead, we also observe the second part of that problem, which is the investment grade or investability of the projects as dictated by excellent project development process and management, and by the talent to sit in that seat when it is not yet apt to build an entire development function or project finance function within a company, but you're absolutely still doing the same type of work and you just can't bear that on your balance sheet yet. So Mark One really lives by the thesis that we are the folks who help you measure twice in planning, putting together that project development plan, to then be in the best position to go cut once with you and essentially execute on project development, everything through the pre-FEED, so the pre-front-end engineering and design stages, an engineering package that Christian would know like the back of his hand, but we're helping put together that really holistic strategy and execution to get there, which was not something we saw any other consultant, broker, or individual operators like fractional CFOs being able to service alone. So we kind of built a SWAT team with project finance talent, siting talent, offtake talent, and regulatory permitting talent to be that SWAT team to help plug in as the company needs it. But the sequencing portion that Jennifer was just talking about is actually one of the things that we find is it's part of the reason Mark One was set up to exist, and one of the things we spend the most of our time on. When you think about the development process, and Dimitri and I just put our heads together for this room, we put the 5 principles of project development down on paper so you can go back and refer to those. But across the 4 primary domains of financial, commercial, siting, and regulatory, and the technical, what you need to do in the development process, and some of the questions in the chat ask this, is think about what are the right risks to retire at the right time so that all of your development process speaks to your current and future investors. And that's the investability problem that we're solving.
Hey, Hannah, maybe a quick question for you. And I think folks like Mark One are incredibly helpful for this ecosystem. And we love to kind of see it. And you know, one of the challenges that we see sometimes is we talk to companies early and, you know, maybe they don't have a site locked in, or they don't have certain kind of critical permits, or they don't have, you know, the offtake quite buttoned up. And we're like, okay, well, we'll have a conversation, say, like, we got to see these things, come back to us. And sometimes it seems pretty obvious they might have like 1 or 2 folks kind of working on that, and it's not clear that they have a whole process around it. Like, where are you seeing kind of the biggest gaps in needs in terms of what companies have and kind of what you guys can fill and kind of what they ultimately need?
Yeah, awesome question, Christian. When Jennifer talked about intimately understanding what every steel mill in the market needed at their journey, whether they were in growth phase or optimization phase, that commercial intuition, that relationship with the customer is never something that you will be able to outsource. And so we often find ourselves working with teams who have just hired or are about to hire some excellent VP of commercial, chief commercial officer, head of biz dev to be that customer, like internal, customer facing, customer dogged individual who is just relentlessly pursuing value proposition, fundamentals, and offtake agreement. The rest of it, the other parts of the process, Christian, is really where we find that we can absolutely advise that biz dev or commercial lead when it comes to what are the terms in that offtake agreement that your investment audience will or will not be able to underwrite, will or will not be excited about, and why might you make strategic trade-offs in, you know, when Jennifer was describing, you know, having them as investors or not, or having them as fully paid joint venture partners where you're providing in-kind services. Like, how do you put that strategy together? That's something we can help advise with, because you have to go talk to the ecosystem to know where the pulse is on the market there. When it comes to some of the other aspects of the development work, Christian, one of the things that we find is it's very hard to just rip an oil and gas engineer and throw him into a geothermal company. It's really hard to just rip an amazing renewables developer, even like an offshore wind person who knows how to do that well, and throw him into the next generation of like electrochemical desalination. Like, even if there are comparables in those industries, the unlearning that developers have to go through, where cost overruns are very predictable, where timelines are very certain, into an environment in first of a kind where all of that has very high barriers of or sensitivities on the error bars. That is a very hard thing to do. And so one of the things that we found is, like, you have to actually find very flexible and entrepreneurially minded development talent, which is part of what Mark One is attempting to do, and what we'll continue to if you're working on that or you think of yourself as a flexible developer, like come on down. The water's warm and warmer every day.
Awesome. I want to bring Patrick into this conversation. So Patrick, I think you guys play a really unique role in the market, which is to help like bridge this kind of like commerciality lens, sort of like the perceived versus real risk. And I think obviously there's the role of capital in doing that. So catalytic finance does that job. But also what are you seeing from founders who come to you and they're like, hey, we need catalytic finance. What are you seeing from founders that they're doing to help bring down perceived risk prior to taking on your money? So what are they doing first that you're like, oh, you warrant our catalytic finance because you've done the work to make that gap of perceived to real risk as small as possible?
Yeah, and I'm gonna start just by nerding out a little bit on like unpacking
Yeah,
what catalytic even means.
do it.
So like I said, I'm a chemical engineer. Jennifer, this one's for you. Uh, so a catalyst, it lowers the activation barrier to make it a little bit easier to get over the hump and to go faster. And then when you're done, you recycle it and do it again. And so it get really nerdy when you say catalytic capital. If somebody comes with, I've got a $50 million project, can I please have $50 million? The answer to that is no. One, because I don't have $50 million. But two, because we're not going to learn anything if we're just providing financing. Catalytic means that we need to identify what are those pockets of excess risk that we can address. But knowing what the excess risk is means that you need to have assembled the team. You need the customer there at the table, the partner who's going to build this. All of the things that, the same package that Christian would describe, what Hannah just talked through on those principles. We need to know that you've done that work. We just recognize that there's still a lot of unknown unknowns, and we have no return objective. We are risk on for that. We're willing to help this to absorb some of that risk, but our goal here is to get more projects sooner. So we want to recycle funds. We don't have a specific return objective, but we do want to make sure that we are helping to get projects to go faster. In order to know that, we can't rely on our own opinions. We have to rely on the market and the teams and the diligence of real market players whose their returns are on the line on this project. So just for a tactical perspective, we're a team of two. So I'm the engineer. My colleague Kyle McEnany is the finance guy. We have our opinions, but we can't rely on our opinions as to which projects are the best. We need to rely on real market players and real teams to help us assess what's going to be the most effective and how are we going to help accelerate across the field, not pick projects in our favorite areas.
Yeah, rock on. I mean, I think this is prove to us that you've done the work is kind of the right message here. Is I think all of these pieces, there's so much complexity that goes into building one of these projects well, but actually the work to make that not a one-time thing is so critically important. And I mean, Christian talked about pipeline. Jennifer, you talked about all these sequencing pieces, and it's not that you're like, oh, I'll do one and then I'll figure out the next one. You have to have that vision and a lot of the work running in parallel for it to actually work on time. And I think maybe before we're going to switch to financing in a moment, but I wanted to just get a quick kind of like one-liner from everybody. We've talked about what it takes to be a good developer of a FOAK project. What are some examples of like bad development you've seen? And I think this has also come up before. Is like there's folks in the comment thread talking about people raising money but then not actually doing anything, or enriching themselves, or some of these other comments. I think that this speaks to like what makes for a bad developer. And I don't mean people who like can't raise the money at all, but like what are some examples of bad development you've seen, if you want to share? Just maybe one each if people want to drop one in here.
Without dropping names, I would actually come back to Hannah talked about how you're talking to different audiences in short order. And
Yeah.
I think one of the points that I always want to get across when we're looking at projects, we're interested in projects. We're not interested in the narrative that sold whatever your last round was. We're interested in the project. And we really need to get the focus on, we need to deliver on projects. And that's we want to help with that transition. And we recognize that at the early stage, you have to be focused on building the narrative and having that arc. But we now want to get to brass tacks and get to the point where we're focused on projects and executing on them.
I'd quickly, I've seen a lot of challenges like multiple cost overruns and delays. And I think the common thread in a lot of those is trying to rush through the process, right? So you raise growth equity, you raise VC, you got all the hype. You're scaling up multiple factors, probably more than makes sense, to be honest, if you're being very methodic about it. And I don't think we have any instances where hard technology throughout our history as modern kind of society has been able to kind of just rush through and step. Like it always sometimes is a decade plus process, right? So trying to rush through kind of building things is very hard, especially in the US with, kind of the slowness that we have around construction and supply chains and that sort of thing, relative to some other countries like China, right? So I think when it's not subsidized, so I do think that you do kind of have to go through this process, and infrastructure investors tend to realize that more than kind of VC does, and so like there's going to constantly be a bit of a tension there where VCs are telling you to go fast, but infrastructure is kind of wanting to see that you've kind of proven that you can do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually that dovetails into the next section really easily, because I think you hit on this idea of sort of de-risking things over time and being really intentional about what you de-risk and what sequence. And I think Hannah, like, why don't we sort of come back to you? How do you guys think about staging this de-risking process in a FOAK project? Is it how does Mark want to approach this when it comes to companies?
I thought Jennifer's layout was very articulate and obviously born from direct experiences. I think that when we think about what bad development looks like, to segue from your last question into your next question, it often means not talking to customers nor investors soon enough. Like even before they're customers or even before they're investors, you should be building those relationships and understanding Pat's golden handcuffs and proclivities toward certain aspects of the project and what makes it catalytic and at what time period is it no longer, and understanding all of those dynamics of the capital stack well ahead of when you think you need them, I think is the key ingredient to keeping the optionality open, or what Jennifer described as like the layers of flexibility that into your plan. So when we think about staging risk across the stages of FOAK, I think that we often find that early customers will dictate some derivative risks like the site, for example, and therefore all of the permitting and other things. And it becomes a little bit of a question of how much effort or work or new learning curves you have to scale in the process of building that FOAK across permitting, community engagement, logistics and transportation and everything that's required in that to figure out based on your early customer and what you can get in the offtake that unlocks your next phase so that it is commercial and not just demonstrative. That I think is often the kind of like first. We have many stage gates in what we think about in the development process, but like that really is one of the first things that drives it. I'll maybe use that as a way to segue here to Jennifer, which is you built your first commercial scale in China. And I think in today's geopolitical environment, that might not be attainable for every company at the moment, but I'd be curious a little bit about how you thought about the talent in your organization that helped you think about staging risk across FOAK scale up.
Whew, that's a tough one, Hannah. So we tend to use local talent everywhere we go. So we do have to have some what I would call, headquarter, wherever it was. Initially it was in New Zealand and then it was in Chicago. But everywhere we go, we have leveraged talent in that country because we feel there's smart people and good people everywhere, right? And it's a great opportunity to learn how to think about where you're doing work. And so our China plants included a couple of people at the time from New Zealand, the demo, but we built a team of Chinese engineers who could do our technology. We trained them in New Zealand and then we moved them back to China. And so then they were the ones, although we did bring some talent from the US at the time we had moved to the US to start up the commercial, but it was all local talent. I find that to be super important, and that is critical to how to make things work. And our partners' talent is also important. So everywhere we have worked, our partners have worked with us to train their specific team, because if you license, eventually you're going to leave and let them run the plant. And so really helping your partner also get the right talent, plan for the right talent and train them, that's something we've done. I do want to comment on something you said a little earlier, Hannah, about flexibility and entrepreneurship. It's really interesting. I see that a lot, right? Because I come from refining as well, that you have this view of how things should go, and then that eventually leads to some of the cost overruns because you haven't imagined certain things. But if you get everything defined on a piece of paper, you will never build anything. Okay, by the time you de-risk it completely on that piece of paper, you will never get on the process of building. So to me, the other important thing is, how do you balance what you have to de-risk on paper before you build your first one, and what you're just going to have to learn at the large scale plant, which is why you can't skip any steps, which is, I think, what Christian was saying. It takes time. You can't go from the lab to your first commercial. You have to go first lab to your first pilot, to your second pilot, to your third pilot, to your demo, and then you can scale. And that level of understanding the balance is I also think critical. We cannot let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Otherwise, we'll never get to this transition.
I want to kind of dig into this cost overrun comment because it's come up a couple of times, right? So I guess this is a question for, I mean, maybe everyone in the room, but are cost overruns inherent? And therefore it's a question of like building your model with them already assumed and having flexibility from your capital providers. Is it a function of people being unprepared or being bad developers? Like, I guess maybe Christian, Patrick, how do you guys see this playing out on the side of as a capital provider? And what do the best developers do around this problem? Is it something that's inherent to the process because it's FOAK, or something else?
It's a good question. I think it is inherent. Because let's say you were redesigning your bathroom for the first time, first type of redesign, you're gonna run into cost overruns. Like I think like I just redesigned my bathroom, we had cost overruns, right? You just have to say no to certain things if you want it precisely the way you wanted. But I think the reality is, like, I don't think it's unknowable, but I think it is inherent. And so, there's one of these things where it's like, well, how much contingency do you put, right? Do you just slap on a 20-30% contingency because you think it's 2x what the industry standard is, and is that sufficient? And then you start to think about, okay, well, what are all my tail risk? And like the reality is, the first time you do anything, there's going to be a lot of tail risk. And so it's just like trying to understand kind of what is the tail risk. And if you go and look at other projects and say like, okay, first time we built anything, right, you probably see a whole lot of cost overruns, and you'll get a better sense of what tail risk actually start to look like. And you can go all the way back to nuclear. You can go to LNG facilities in the US. There's so many examples of where you see tail risk the first time we build things. And no, it's not exactly like your project, but it is the first time that we are building some of these things. And I think we need to do a better job of just like finding these reference projects and then getting a sense of what those tail risks looking like, and getting in line with your investors and saying, look, we're doing this, and like, I know you guys want to see 20% contingency potentially for this cost, but what are we going to do if it looks more like 50 to 100%, right? Like, we're going to do everything that we can to get it under that, but we need a plan to kind of deal with some of those challenges. And it's often kind of that unknown, that piece of it that's very hard to kind of assess, that keeps infrastructure investors on the sideline until you start to kind of know what that unknown looks like.
I want to echo one. I just want to I congratulate you for bringing HGTV into the FOAK discussion. I feel like there's the moment where you find out, oh no, it turns out that's a structural. We need to add another 50,000 to this project. So yeah, okay,
You
that's gonna
cannot
happen
put a
forward.
toilet there.
Uh, there was a question here in the chat that on insurance, and I just wanted to sort of highlight here that this is an area that we're very interested in. Insurance is hard because the data is pretty sparse. This is something that we'd like to sort of help across the ecosystem to where we can get anonymized data to get a better handle on cost overruns, on performance, on things that should in principle be insurable, but are kind of difficult because we don't really have the data backing to do it. But one of the partners that we've been working with, Greenie Re is a reinsurance company that was actually launched under GGRF funding. Thankfully, they're not tied up in Citibank, so they're a going concern. But GGRF, obviously, there's no technology risk associated to be eligible for that. So we've been thinking with them about how could we apply the insurance model and develop insurance products for first of a kind for early projects. Cost overrun would be one of many possible things that could be insured. But that's one of the tools that we're very interested in. As I said at the beginning, we want to help identify the excess risk and find ways that we can help address it. And insurance is just a great tool to help do that.
Can you, maybe Patrick, can you spend a few minutes talking about other products you've seen work that support this like risk? I mean, I want to call it credit enhancement, but it's not always credit. So like, what are some of the instruments you've seen work? Is it loan loss reserves? Is it, anchor grants? Is it, sort of like, oh, we'll do the construction financing even though it's not happening, and then you can get taken out by someone else? Like, what are some of these catalytic finance products that you've seen really work in the folks space? And maybe just a couple of comments on like who's actually deploying them, right? Is it just philanthropy? Are there investors that are doing things that are creative? Can you walk us through this a little bit?
Yeah, I don't know that any of us can declare victory on folk. I'd say that's
Oh,
why we're here.
definitely.
What I would say is for ways that philanthropic capital that could be deployed effectively, I think we need to draw inspiration from other arenas. So in development capital, they've become quite sophisticated at using philanthropic capital and first loss pools, other ways of doing credit enhancement to help make a project go. And part of our inspiration, first acknowledging I'm a lowly engineer and leaning very heavily on my colleagues who know finance far better than I. But if we're looking at excess risk, and we can see in the development capital context, in development projects, where we're looking at currency risk or political risk, and finding ways that you can use philanthropic capital to help backstop that. I guess it's our thesis here that some of those same tools of loan guarantees, other ways of doing credit enhancements, could be applied to technology risk just as well. It's a different flavor of risk. We're going to need different data to back that. But we want to be deploying some of that toolkit that philanthropy has deployed in low-income housing, in the developing world, in other contexts, and try to bring that into emerging technologies. And I think we're a little bit behind the curve on that relative to some other fields.
I could not agree more. I think I've often been really frustrated by how much institutions that have very flexible capital talk about the need for these projects to get built, their desire to be catalytic, and then their lack of application of things that we know work to this space. And I think there's the number of institutions that are actually walking the walk is pretty small. And that's, I think, that's an opportunity for people like Schmidt to go out there and say, hey, look at what we did, this work. Now this project's in the ground. You can also do this too, X Foundation or whoever else. Okay, I think I want to spend a little bit more time on this because what we've seen a lot is that people will start to go out for their FOAK project and they will look for outside financing, and then they are shocked and surprised by the cost of capital. And so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what it actually costs to finance a FOAK project. If, obviously there are people who will do it just with equity. Some folks will get a grant from, the DOE or whoever to build their first demonstration plant. But maybe starting with you, Christian, and then going around the room, like, what should people expect in terms of the cost of financing for, let's say, a FOAK project versus a SOAK or NOAK project?
Yeah.
Like, how does that cost curve change over time?
Yeah, I mean, the unfortunate answer depends, right? Like, I think if we're talking about something that is truly kind of at TRL 7 going to TRL 8, so from pilot to demo or demo to pilot to first commercial, I think you should not expect anything that is under 20%, kind of cost of capital. Right. And I think the reality is, like, it does look more like growth equity, right? So you're probably in between 20 to 30%. And I think you can get that, way lower, as significantly lower, if you have first loss capital, if you have subsidized capital. And as you kind of move from first to second to third, especially if those second and third look like the first project and you have good data on that first project. Right. And so I think sometimes folks come to us expecting kind of mid-teen returns on a first project. And it's, quite frankly, we're not going to do something that's going from pilot to demo, or, maybe if you have like an actual scale demo and you're going from demo to commercial, we will actually consider it. And you have, very buttoned up and good developers on the project. But even in that case, that's probably at best, maybe you start to get into kind of high teens, like there's still some risk there we have to consider. But folks who kind of expecting low to mid teens, it's just very challenging. And like, yes, you can definitely go out and get maybe back in the day LPO and maybe some other subsidized capital that's going to bring that total cost of capital down. But in terms of your project equity coming from folks like us, that's gonna cost more.
Yeah, and I would imagine that people aren't generally getting debt for their FOAK or maybe even their SOAK project, right? Like, if you're getting it as coming from concessionary sources, because I don't know, maybe I don't speak for all lenders, but we lend against commercial POs with climate companies, and we are very, I would say, risk tolerant compared to banks or large institutional investors, and even we won't do the first contract. Like, we just not, there's nothing it's not a debt opportunity, really.
Yeah. Well, every now and then you will find some good collateral in a project. I think in like green cement.
Right, if you're willing to do, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's
But
right.
then you do tie your project up.
Sure.
Pretty significantly.
But I think often the challenge there is that, like, yeah, you have all this equipment, you might have a facility, you might have land, whatever, and it will all have some residual value. But you also need somebody to be able to, if the project gets built, or partially built, like, who's going to finish it? Is it worth finishing? Like, and figuring out what the value of that project is if that developer no longer exists, that becomes a challenge, and that's like a whole other conversation. Jennifer, I'm curious to hear from you, in terms of your experience of raising capital for these projects. Are you, Kate, can you share anything about the costs you've seen over time and how you guys think of the cost of financing in these contexts?
So that's a really great question. And I want to comment that times have evolved a lot in terms of who finances projects. And like I said, we were doing licenses. And so, when you're working with somebody like ArcelorMittal, it's a very different cost of capital profile when they're the ones building the plant than when you are the one building a plant. So I would say I was very fortunate to have lived through a time when we had licensees that were willing to take licenses to do growth projects. I honestly believe that it has gotten harder. I think now a lot of people are not as keen. Right now is not the time when people are saying, well, I've got to grow my business and I'm going to do new things. That's not happening everywhere. And if you say the word green, used to be there was a green premium. Now there's actually green debit. And so I think it's even more difficult now than it was then. And it's because of a transition to this is kind of not the space to be in right now in a lot of ways. And so that makes financing harder because the large strategics cannot explain to the board that they're going to put 100 million into this growth new green project. So now you've got to work with them to raise capital in conventional financial terms, and everything that Patrick has highlighted becomes important. And it just gets that much harder because, as you've said, Dimitri, as Hannah said, as Christian's also said, reinforcing what Patrick has said, is what is the risk profile? The risk profile is now front and center. So now you've got to insure. Well, when you insure, you add to the cost of capital. And it was already expensive because the first time you build a plant, okay, you put belts and suspenders on it. That's the most expensive plant you're ever going to build, unless you're such a risk taker that you don't care if the technology works and you're going to fix that $100 million plant, which no smart person does, right? So it is harder. You're adding costs, you're adding a lot of things that are not the usual EPC contingency, but now you're also adding other contingency. Now your cost of capital is higher because you're doing more of it than your very large partner. So I think the environment today has made things just that much harder. So I don't know if that answers your question, Dimitri, but
Yeah.
I just want you to know that I don't think it's actually easier, even though there are new vehicles. Like you look at breakthrough energy catalysts, you look at what governments are doing, you look at all of these things, and you say, well, it's actually getting easier. But I think all in is not easier. It's hard.
Mm.
It's a sombering tone, but
I'm
I
sorry.
have to agree with you, Jennifer. I fully agree with everything you just said. And frankly, Dimitri, to be a little spicy here, if I may,
Let's do it.
this is a little different than I think where we were talking about. One of our first events was like the cost of capital together late last year. You can all go back and watch the recording. It was very rich, pre-election or maybe just post-election. My hot take today is that you would have to be in the top 98th percentile of projects with a lot of luck blowing in your sales to be optimizing for the cost of capital. This is not a founder's market. This is not a FOAK market. So your job, like respectfully, your job as founders is to be default alive, and optimizing for the cost of capital or the recaps or the like ROFR type of terms that you might have to do to get something built in today's market. It is an existential question of like, do you want to be doing this or not? Do you want to throw in the towel or not? And I think you have to be default alive, and you have to find terms in the market with a laser focus on customer value. And I think it's a luxury to be thinking about optimizing the cost of capital for FOAK right now.
Yeah. I couldn't. Yeah, go ahead, Jennifer.
No, you finish and then I'll pipe in. I want to make a comment.
No, I was going to go to Patrick to talk a little bit about how catalytic capital works with costs, but why don't you say your point and then we can do it?
No, all I was going to say is I wasn't trying to be sombering. I was just trying to be realistic, because realistic gets you timeline. And I think when we talk about cost escalation and we talk about some of these things, it really is an exercise in timeline validation and what it takes to get to a certain stage. Sometimes the cost overruns are because you had to have the engineers on play for an extra 6 months. And so be careful that you need to be realistic about where you're living and that moment in time and how that plays into your timeline, which then plays into your costs. And then how do you raise the capital for that? Because what is the commitment you're making? So like I said, I wasn't trying to be sombering. I just need for us to get into the right headspace to create success.
Yeah, and I think this is really important because we had a very similar conversation at the San Francisco Climate Week, where we talked about how hard it is to raise venture capital today, how hard it is. I mean, it's the capital markets today are, at least in my experience, probably the hardest I've seen in about 15 years, especially in climate. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you should give up. It just means you should plan accordingly, right? So it means you need to have more conversations than you thought. It's going to take longer than you thought. You might need more credit enhancement or catalytic capital than you thought. People might require greater evidence to proceed. And that means you need to get creative into how you build that, to Patrick's point, that data that allows people to feel comfortable moving forward, right? This is true everywhere. It's true in venture markets. The goalposts for Series A have shifted. And that's true in SaaS, it's true in climate. And I think coming back to this, there's one thing that I always wonder about, because I actually started my career in the catalytic finance industry, is providing sort of catalytic money to folks funding clean tech in emerging markets, which is where a lot of catalytic finance, to Patrick's point earlier, got its start, because there is no equity capital there to act as risk tolerant money, right? So you need catalytic dollars. And so, Patrick, I'm curious, in the cases where you guys have participated, right? Is it that the cost of capital from other investors has stayed the same, but now they're willing to come in because there's catalytic money? Or is it that catalytic money comes in alongside them and then their cost goes down? Like, what is the actual impact? Is it just a question of bringing people to the table, or is it actually changing the economics of the project because catalytic finance is at the table?
So,
or does it vary?
It's going to vary quite a bit, but I'd say maybe in the time where, we've at the Family Foundation, we've been at this for a little bit more than a year. So we're coming in at a really, really hard time for raising. So part of our motivation was looking at some of these early projects where your only choice is to go raise more venture and do it off of balance sheet. That was never a good idea, but that becomes now, that's not only not a bad idea, that's just plain impossible right now.
Yeah.
And part of what we're looking is to help make that transition where we look at this. Christian alluded to it earlier, where you have one project returns the funds, one win returns the fund, versus go to the infrastructure side where one failure kills the fund. And it just seems natural that the market should fill in the gap. And I think all things equal, the market eventually will. But for climate tech, time's not on our side. So we want to take risk tolerant capital so that we can help accelerate that process so that we can get over to the project focused, risk averse capital sooner. And a lot of that meant, in some cases we have just done provided loans when the market would not provide a loan, or we've provided slightly lower interest. But ultimately, we're not interested in topco equity. We're not interested in how your company's going to take over the world. We're interested in more projects sooner, and that's just on the fundamentals of each project.
Maybe I'd add to that a little bit in that, I think it's a very interesting space. And if you look at Clean Tech 1.0 to climate tech to kind of wherever we go next, I do think that funding gap, that valley of death, has narrowed a bit, but we've taken a lot more shots at goal. And I think the reality is, like, we've had more catalytic capital come in, which is great. And I think we need to learn from it. And so some of what's going on now, Dimitri, that you mentioned, I think it's good and it's healthy. And if you look at other industries that have probably done a better job of this, and they have different, kind of characteristics that make it a little bit easier. So if you look at biotech and how do they go through different stages of drugs, and you have a clear FDA approval process. But I think what's been interesting there is, like, they've done a very good job of digitizing their process. And so you have like a very clean kind of capital stack and kind of process that you go through to even get to hundreds of millions to billions of dollars in developing new drugs. I think we need to build something like that kind of works for our industry, where we're learning, we have the data, and then you can kind of got to go through these capital stacks. And to Patrick's point, you have something that fills in between infrastructure and VC. But there's just this whole kind of like price discovery process that we don't have unless we have the data. And that's where I think, for the folks who can kind of be catalytic are super helpful in starting to build that data. But we have to quickly start to get private capital involved in that once they can do more of that price discovery. Like, what do I pay for a project that has potential for, massive cost overruns? But, like, can we start to discover what those cost overruns look like so we can kind of structure the right capital around it?
The conversation, Dimitri, just to jump in here, that I think hearing a lot of folks grapple with. The difference between licensing to bolt on or brownfielding to then greenfielding and building like a gigascale massive, need all of the like bells and whistles of full stack project development, and to show that you can build, develop, own, and operate. Those are very different scale up journeys that you can kind of deploy at different times and have very different capital intensity profiles. And the more flexibility there may be within the business model or the technology itself, the better. I was chatting with someone in the thread here about modular versus, non-linear scale up processes. And when you have a non-linear technology, let's say like a membrane, for example, or a bioreactor, which LanzaTech does, you can't always choose to bolt on or choose to have smaller, more modular kind of CapEx. However, if there is any of that flexibility in what you're building or how you provide value to customers, that often can be a more default alive position in which to build. And so I've had a decent number of conversations over the last, honestly, month with founders who are exploring what does the more fundamental smaller size of my unit or reactor or technology profile look like in order to be on site in operating conditions with customers that show that the technology works, that other investors can come look, touch, feel, and hopefully not smell. And that you can really, if you do even have cost overruns on the 2x to 3x size, we're talking tens of millions of dollars that you might be able to cushion within your own topco equity balance sheet. We're not talking about half a bill. I would say the kind of watch out that, Via Separations has already deployed their first of a kind technology. Shreya wrote extensively about some of her decision making with a really sharp woman out of Stanford named Madison Freeman. They wrote in the Stanford Law case reviews about how she made her decision to scale up between 100x versus 10x, and why she actually chose the 100x over the 10x, even though many venture investors, myself included, might have said like, oh, well, the lower CapEx of 10x will be better. When she did the analysis, like pouring concrete, laying pipe, the like fixed cost of doing any project made the 100x worth it. And so because of her technology CapEx total profile, it made sense. Anyways, you have to make that trade-off call, but that type of strategy and like scenario planning can sometimes be the difference between are we optimizing for cost of capital for a $500 million raise, or are we talking about, potentially trying to get something done with revenues and profitability, even if it's not an underwritable single digit IRR. And that's where someone like, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Pat, but like that's something where catalytic capital can play a role where other market forces will not step in.
I think one thing too here that can be often counterintuitive is how like excitement and perception play into the fundraising success. So talking about this like choice, I'm going to do a $10 million thing or a $100 million thing. And this is something that we've run into. So we manage a couple different funds. We decided to make our second fund smaller than folks may have suggested. And what we found when we went to a lot of catalytic investors or early investor impact aligned investors is that we had made it too small. And we had said, oh, we want to prove at this scale that it works. We want to demonstrate, we want to be rigorous and prudent with our scale up of our credit platform. And what we found was that a lot of investors are like, well, if it's under 50 to 100 million, we won't even look at it. And so, and these are folks who say they're catalytic. So there's also that trade-off that I think people need to consider is like, how big is exciting enough versus not? And also, are you opening or closing doors by choosing the smaller or larger option? And it's not saying that you should always go for the bigger one, right? Oftentimes, that's all, like, I've made that mistake too. We once started a microgrid catalytic finance facility back when I was at Facebook, and we put up $2.5 million. We said, okay, we're going to go big. It's going to be $100 million. It's going to be awesome. Microsoft is in, Schneider's in, all these people are in. And we went after the shiny thing, and we should have gone with the smaller one. And it ended up failing because we couldn't actually secure all the financing, even though we were an anchor. There's all these other anchors. And so both can be wrong. But I think you need to be really intentional about the choices and how that messaging lands with different investors. And I don't know, Pat, if you've seen this play out too, where people either go too small or too big, and that gets them into trouble.
I mean, I would, yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of stories of, having to raise, going for the big raise puts you on a unsustainable. Shooting for the exponential growth is not necessarily the right match for the technology. I think that's a common enough story that I don't need to repeat it. One thing I'd say at the small end, though, and you already, and Jennifer mentioned, Breakthrough Catalyst is out there. That's a really, really important player. But you're at a pretty big size before you're really eligible for that. And there are a lot of, meritorious projects that are going to be $50 million or less. And that's something that we're actually very interested. Some of those may lead to $200 million projects down the line, but some of them can just be, and we're seeing this especially in at supplemental cementitious materials, so partial replacements for Portland cement. A lot of those things can actually be pretty small, relatively local, and things that aren't going to make a great venture story, but can be profitable businesses that are going to be coming in at the, say $10 million or maybe even less in some cases. And there's not a natural home in the ecosystem that wants to fund those things. It's not going to deliver venture returns. It's too small for traditional lenders to come in on it. That's an attractive space for us, is looking at these opportunities that make sense, that are small, whether they're on a path to growth or whether it's just a roll up and repeat of something of that size. That's a bit of a gap in the market, some of these smaller projects.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I think that's and we're seeing that in the credit ecosystem as well. That's part of the motivation for Enduring Planet existing, is that there's all these lenders who work in climate, but they're like, yeah, we won't look at a deal unless it's 20 million plus or 10 million plus or 50 million plus. But to get to that point, you need to be able to grow and borrow. And so there's all this opportunity in the, I would say, like $100K to $20 million range. There's just like not served. And there's a lot of opportunity for that. Okay, we actually have a whole other section that we were going to get to, but we're not going to because we're almost out of time. We have 9 minutes left. Hannah, I'm going to let you make your point in just a second, but I just wanted to pose a question to the audience. If you have questions that have come up that are not sort of like, that didn't come up through the course of the panel so far, please drop them in the chat. We want to respond to your questions before we leave. So this is the time. We've got 9 minutes left. So Hannah, while you make your point, please drop any new questions into the chat and we'll get to them before we close up for today. Go ahead, Hannah.
Go for it, Dimitri. In our last 8-ish minutes, we could talk about some data points.
Yep. Take it away. Which data points should we talk about?
Amazing. My question's about data points. Christian thinks a lot about this in his nights, weekends, every hour of every day. Jennifer, I maybe want to come to you first, but then Christian, I'd love you to banter in here about when you're building, let's say you can thread the needle. Let's say you can build a sub 50 million project. You can blend a capital stack to make that work. How do you build a credible like cost and performance model to get investors excited about that, Jennifer, when there hasn't yet been any precedent? And then what data do you extract from what isn't a $200 million deployment that would get, Pat's friends and infrastructure financing excited, Next excited? How do you extract that data of what went well, what went bad, what you learned, and bring that to the fore for your next round of financing?
I think the most important thing is your EPC partner. At the end of the day, you need to work with somebody who knows enough about the engineering and can do the, you got to get the cost estimate from plus or minus 50, which is you're living the dream, to plus or minus 10, where you actually know what this is going to cost. And that bridge between those two things is something your engineering team has to do with an EPC. I think that's the only way to do it. And so my only message is that you build a relationship. What I've learned is a good relationship with specific EPC partners who can work with you, Because if you put on belt and suspenders and they put on belts and suspenders, by the time you're done, your $50 million project is a $1 billion project. So you just got to make sure you're working with an engineering partner who can work with you to realistically dream up what that FOAK looks like.
That's really helpful. I know we've got some EPCs like Jagmeet from Black and Veatch commenting in the chat here today. So thanks for joining us. Fluor has played a meaningful role in helping set up Mark One. Those are integral partners along the way. But Christian, you spend a lot of time also thinking about the segmentation of data to finance through the different stages of development, when that's pre-feed, feed, pre-NTP, construction loans. Like, what are you thinking these days? What do you wish you had in your magic wand around better FOAK data in those segments?
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about true first of a kind, like if you can actually get an EPC to lean in and actually wrap the project and give you a fixed price contract for the whole thing, that's amazing, right? Like we don't see very many of it, and I think they'd be great to see more of it. I think the challenge is like the risk just all goes to the EPC, and you know, for good reason, they may not want to take all of that, right? So your black box, whatever you're building, and then look, maybe they'll do full ROS for certain types of projects, but like if it's the TRL7 going to a TRL8 or TRL9, like I do think that could be hard. And so, and if you have change orders, you have changes in design, like who does that fall on? How do you think about that risk allocation? That is what we're constantly thinking about, right? And so it's like what else do you have in your contracts? Whether it's with the off-taker, whether it's with the EPC, whether it's with your feedstock, whatever the case might be, like that's where we see all of the risk. Because if you're telling your off-taker that you're gonna get them the project at COD +1, but the reality is you do have real risk that it could be delayed till COD +2 or whatever, like that's something that we have to consider, and then think about to what extent can we potentially lose that contract and can materially hurt our returns if you're delivering this project you've never delivered before and you're promising it's going to be a COD +1. So I think thinking about all of those things and like how do you actually show us that, you know, similar projects or your earlier stage projects have been able to deliver at kind of those expectations is what's super important for us.
Can you define COD +1 for folks?
Start of operations. I forget what the exact commercial operation data. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, so I think Hannah just asked a question in the
Yeah,
chat.
just to put me on the spot. So one, I think that this is that would require pooled resources. That's I don't think any one funder is going to put up enough funding that could back a portfolio that way. But I do think that that's one of the messages we're trying to get among our peer funders is that thinking creatively about using our capital to help protect downside risk is a way to unlock a lot more money. It's just a much more effective way of mobilizing the trillions of dollars of capital that are out there with our millions of dollars that we can deploy. And the other point is, you know, that we haven't talked too much about the current environment in the US, but with the federal pullback, we're going to have to think more creatively because a lot of the DOE grants and the like that can help with non-dilutive capital are going to become less available. So finding tools like this certainly a big goal for us. And Hannah, I would love if we could get philanthropy to provide that level of risk protection. Right? We're not close to that, but maybe that can be a long-term goal.
Yeah, I think a good example to look at, Pat, and happy to connect you with that team if you're not already, is the Community Investment Guarantee Pool. So we actually just got we're working on a guarantee with them for our fund, and I think that's a good example of like a bunch of philanthropies coming together and saying, hey, we want to de-risk this space. Let's all do it together. And we've heard a lot of talk from philanthropies about supposedly doing that, you know, the Capital Consortium or all these groups, but we haven't actually seen a lot of cases where folks do come together to offer that product, you know, on a single project. So I think we definitely need more of that. Okay, there's a couple more there's a couple more questions. I'm trying to figure out which one to do last, or if we should just wrap. And then, given that it's already 11:28, I think maybe what we'll do is we'll close up for the day. We will be we'll be publishing the recording of this and a summary of the sort of highlights and notes whenever Hannah and I have a chance to write it up. So hopefully in the next couple of weeks. Huge thank you to everyone for joining this event today. We will have another event in June that should be planned quite shortly. If you want to, you can subscribe to our calendar of events, in which case you'll get a notification once the June event is posted. We'll probably take at least a 1-month break this summer, but then we will have a big live event at New York Climate Week for folks who want to meet up in person. So huge thank you, Christian, Jennifer, Pat, Hannah. Thank you so much for today. This was super insightful and I think quite a unique conversation. And I'm personally very grateful, and I think a lot of folks on the channel are too. So have a great rest of your day, everyone, and good luck finding that FOAK money.
We'll need some kind of filtration and separation.
Thank you all.